Well, thanks, Ashley. Thanks for having me. Jeff Bender is the one that invited me to do this, so it's a little bit outside of what I normally get to do. I appreciate the opportunity. Just a quick intro about me. I am a Navy psychologist. I've been in the Navy for over 20 years. I am a neuropsychologist, so work primarily with the Navy's traumatic brain injury programs. You'll probably see the influence of that in the way I approach this. I look at it really from a kind of a brain, how the brain processes information point of view. And so that's kind of my bias. I'll give that up front. Looking forward to having a conversation. When Jeff was asking me about this, he said that typically they ask people to hold questions until the end. I'll tell you, I don't like giving lectures. I like having discussions. So please feel free to use the raise hand option or drop something in chat. I'll try and keep an eye on that. Maybe Ashley can help me too. We have a small enough group that if I have a pause, we might be able to even just unmute and have a little bit of a discussion about different points as we go along. So I think the more input, the more interactive it is, the more entertaining for all of us, since you're all just as little 1-inch squares rather than real life people where we get to interact. Ashley, you had that up before. Do you want me to share my screen then? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
unless you prefer, it's up to you.
Nope, either way, I think I got it here if I can figure it out. Okay, so does that show up for you now?
Yep, looks great.
It makes it so I can see fewer of you though. So, but we'll just go through, and I might not notice hand raises. So Ashley or someone just jump in and we'll go from there. All right. Um, we have 2 monitors set up on our computers here. And when I did that, it did something weird with my second monitor, but I'm not going to take time. We'll just go through. So the overview, I'd like to identify some of the factors that contribute to conflict and to escalation of conflict, right? Because that's really the issue, right? If we could all resolve conflict without it getting out of hand, we wouldn't even have to have this conversation. And like I said, I'm going to focus on primarily the brain information processing side of it. So we're going to spend a lot of our time focusing on our personal reactions that add to conflict and what we can do about that. Twofold reason for that. One, I think it's a big part of it. And then the second is, I think most of us are probably not going to be in the role of being professional mediators. So getting in detail on all the different models for conflict resolution might not be as helpful as kind of basic skills that can apply in a wide range of situations. Talk about some of the actions that each of us as individuals can take to reduce the conflict, and then what to do in an inferno, right? So if it just keeps going and going, and if you were able to figure it out, my intent with the title, and I'll admit right now, I'm not a creative person. So the title was, there's smoke, and oftentimes conflicts are about things other than what may be readily apparent on the surface. And so this is really about learning how to kind of de-escalate to get to the core of what's driving that conflict so you can put out the actual fire instead of just fanning smoke out of the way. Again, expectation management. This is not intended to make you a professional negotiator. The intention is to give you a few ideas of skills and tricks that you can use if this comes up to kind of manage things in an everyday setting. I have my standard disclaimer that we have here. Whatever I present here is my own opinion and is not intended to be representative of the Navy, the Naval Academy where I currently work, or the Department of Defense, kind of our standard disclaimer. So what causes conflict? We all hear in politics, it's the economy, stupid, right? But for what causes conflict, I think the amygdala plays a role. And I'm going to start right off by trying to have some conversation here. Either put it in chat or blurt out, raise your hand. What is the amygdala and what does it do? Does anyone know anything about that?
It's part of the brain, right?
Yep, it is indeed. What do you know what it does?
Is it part of the reptilian brain that just well, I'm going to guess fight, flee. Yeah, I'm going to guess that. I can't imagine where that information is coming from.
You're exactly right. So the amygdala, we kind of think of it generally as like the alarm center of the brain, right? The amygdala triggers the fight or flight response when we feel threatened, right? It's the part that can make us angry, upset, defensive. So that's exactly it. And then that will lead to fight, flight, or freezing. We often don't think about freezing, but freezing is another response that humans and animals have in the face of a threat. So, we'll take just a little bit of a detour here. If you talk about why would the brain do this for a threat, so prehistoric times, right, as the brain is developing, caveman or cavewoman's confronted by a saber-toothed tiger, you want your body to be ready to fight, to get out of there, or maybe to play dead, right? Like possums will play dead, some bugs play dead. So freezing sometimes is a defensive reaction when we feel threatened. So conflict can trigger that threat response in our brain, and the amygdala fires up and says, uh-oh, you're under attack. You better get ready to defend yourself by either fighting or fleeing or freezing or playing dead. So when the amygdala turns that fight or flight response on, and does anyone know what happens with the body? Or maybe you can think of a time that you've felt threatened or angry. Think back, what was happening in your body then? What sensations were you feeling physiologically? What was happening?
I would say rapid heart rate, maybe adrenaline release.
Yep, absolutely right. So hormonal changes, adrenaline, cortisol, that adrenaline pumps up the heart rate. What other physical changes? A bad gut feeling. Yep. Sometimes people will say they feel butterflies or knots in their stomach, even feel nauseous. Yep. What else happens? Anyone ever tense up, clench your jaw, shoulders get tight? Yep, feel more aggressive, tension, there we go. Breathing becomes more rapid. Does anyone ever notice that kind of tunnel vision type of sensation, right? You're really focused in on what it is. Maybe your face feels flushed or red. Your hands may feel cold and clammy. What does all of that have to do with fight or flight? Why would your body be doing that? Especially think about things like a bad gut feeling or nausea. What does that have to do with self-protection?
Spurs you to react, I suppose.
Maybe, right? So yeah, to give you a warning, it might be to give you a warning, right? So the amygdala has already detected the warning. And so the amygdala, as the alarm system, is turning on the fight or flight response, which is a series of physiologic biochemical changes, right? So the adrenaline and the cortisol trigger all these other changes. Heart rate increases, muscle tension increases, cold and clammy. All of these things that we're talking about are to prepare you to fight or to flee, right? So if you're going to fight or run away, you want your heart pumping blood throughout your body. You want your large muscles fueled up and tense and ready to go. The nausea, the gut feeling kind of thing, is actually your body's attempt to save energy. Your body's like, okay, if this is life or death situation, I'm diverting all my energy to the large muscle groups to survival. I don't need to finish digesting that last meal, divert the energy. That's the same reason people feel like cold and clammy hands. Circulation gets diverted from the periphery to the large muscle groups. More blood to the brain. That's why people's faces feel flushed. All these things that happen physiologically, all these things that we feel when we're anxious or angry or threatened, are all the body's attempts to help us fight or to flee. So if that's the case, is there any problem with the amygdala turning this on in conflict? Well, think about it. Most of the conflicts that we face day to day, is fighting or fleeing the best response? Most often not, right? So, if we're in a dark alley and we're getting mugged, that type of conflict, we probably do want fight or flight. Conflicts in the workplace, fighting or fleeing are probably not the most effective ways to handle that. I like to use the example of a car alarm. We like to have car alarms in case somebody tries to break in our car and steal it, but we all know they're not very accurate. They'll go off for all kinds of reasons, right? And so if I have an alarm on my car and I hear it go off, I don't just automatically call the police every time I hear my alarm. I look out the window. If there's somebody there, then I'll yell at them and call the police. But if not, I turn the alarm off and go about what I'm doing. In a similar way, when the amygdala sets off an alarm, if we feel threatened, it's important for us to be able to learn to pause and look at that and say, okay, do I need this fight or flight response? Or is this actually going to get in the way and help me add fuel to the fire, actually add to the conflagration? And if I can turn that off, will I be in a better position to help resolve what's actually going on here? So that's where I like to spend a little bit of time, is how you identify that, how you change that, and use that as kind of the starting point as keeping conflicts from escalating, and then being able to resolve them later on. So how do you know if someone else's alarm is going off? I have a bunch of things here. Maybe think of some other time when someone was getting angry or upset and a conflict was starting to escalate. Maybe give an example, or tell me if these are things that you saw, or if you saw something else. What are things that you notice that might trigger your amygdala that tell you somebody else is heading towards a conflict? No thoughts? Nobody ever has any conflicts to draw on? That's great. Yeah, so usually people will get loud, they'll get aggressive, right? Um, they may become more argumentative, more animated, all the things we were just talking about, right? You may see their posture change. Um, or they may also withdraw, they may give up, they may surrender, they may look defeated. So that may be the other side of it, the fight or the play dead side. Yeah, so body language, right? All those things we were just talking about. Thanks, Penny. So if you see those things going on, oftentimes it will start to trigger a defensive reaction in us, because if we see someone looking more threatening or more angry, our amygdala is going to go off and say, uh-oh, I see a conflict coming. I'm going to get ready to protect myself here. And so we talked about what are the things that people do. So again, they'll be attacking, they'll be belligerent, invoke authority. They may try and disengage or just give in, acquiesce. So there's a wide range of ways that people can respond. So there's not just a set way. So it's good to keep in mind kind of who you're dealing with, how they react, and be ready to address any of these that come up. So there's a conflict there. You can see that somebody's been activated, their amygdala is firing. Let's say your amygdala is firing and you have all those things going on in your body that we talked about. Does anyone know how to turn that off? If we have that automatic fight or flight reaction that the reptilian brain, which is, it's a good alarm system, but it's not really smart. The reptilian brain doesn't say, I need fight or flight here, or I don't need fight or flight there. All the reptilian brain says, I'm being threatened. I'm going to get you ready to protect yourself. So deep breath. Can you expand on that, Penny? Why would a deep breath help with all those other things? Or anyone else? Yep, it gives you minutes, slows things down. Yep. Was someone else going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is Ashley, and I certainly find myself just holding my breath when I'm in what I perceive as a threatening situation. So actually just remembering to breathe at all is helpful.
Yeah, exactly. When you hold your breath, what does the rest of your body do?
It definitely tenses up from head to toe.
Right? And you're not getting good oxygen into your brain to help think clearly. Okay, yeah, so being able to think about the right way. So you're talking about building in some space here, right? If you take a minute to breathe, you're not reacting, you're breathing, which will give you hopefully a minute of clarity. Think of the things that we talked about that happens when the amygdala kicks in. Can anyone just tell your adrenal glands, hey, look, I don't need you, stop turning off, stop producing adrenaline? Not really, right? We tell our bodies stop producing cortisol? No. Does anyone know how to tell your digestive tract, like, okay, go ahead and process that last meal? We can't do that, right? So Penny hit on one thing, right? So taking a breath, out of all those things that happen, there are only two that we have direct control over. So one is breathing. Any idea what the other one is? Think of the changes that we have. What else can you control?
I try to control where my, excuse me, where my head is, kind of the brain itself.
The
To
thoughts.
just
Yeah.
to say kind of stop, be calm, keep control. So kind of manage the emotion side of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so when I look at stress reactions, right, I kind of break it into the cognitive strategies, what my brain is doing, and then the physiologic that we're talking about. Now, it looks like Tara, is it Tara or Tar? Tension is the other one, right? So out of all those things that the body does to get us ready for fight or flight, if I want to turn that off, there are only two things that I have direct control over. One of them is my breathing, and one of them is my muscle tension. So I can say, I want my muscles to be tense, or I want my muscles to be relaxed. I can tell myself I want to breathe more quickly or I want to breathe more slowly. So if anyone has ever practiced any breathing, um, what happens to your heart rate when your breathing slows down?
It slows.
Yeah, your heart rate slows down too, right? So I told you I'm a neuropsychologist and I'm going to approach this from a brain processing perspective, right? So when your breathing slows and your heart rate slows, the vagus nerve pays attention to that and says, oh, breathing is slow, heart rate is slow, maybe I don't need fight or flight. And so then if you couple that with all the other things that people are saying here. So Paula, you said if we can control what we say, other people are saying, think about it the right way. So if I can slow down my physiology and pay attention to the thought process, how I'm responding to this threat, then I can turn off fight or flight. Now, it may take a while to feel calmed down because those hormones get in our bloodstream and they can linger there for 20 minutes or more, right? So we may still feel worked up even as we're trying to calm it down, but we can turn off that fight or flight response, but we can't depend on the amygdala to do it. To get really nerdy with you here, it's actually the prefrontal cortex of the brain that is kind of like the manager part of the brain. We call it executive functions. That's the part that is the checks and the balance to the amygdala. So the amygdala is the alarm center. The prefrontal cortex is the manager part that says, okay, got the alarm. I looked out to see what it is. Fight or flight's not what I need here, so let me turn this off. And then on to all the other things that you people are saying in chat about, okay, let me look at how to respond. How do I control what I say? How do I come up with a solution? It's a lot harder to think clearly if we're in fight or flight mode. So if we can turn fight or flight mode off, then we can be more problem solving oriented, right? So there's one more thing that's kind of unique about humans. Has anyone ever experienced just thinking about maybe a past or an upcoming situation that was stressful and you get yourself into a fight or flight situation without even being in the situation, just by thinking about it? I'd be willing to bet that everyone has, right? Um, yeah, so humans, because our brains are so complex and we have such great abstract thinking ability, we can imagine situations in our head that are real enough that we turn on the fight or flight response. We trigger the amygdala just by things that we think about. So it's not enough to breathe deep and relax. We also have to be aware of what we're thinking. Do like everyone's saying, take that count to 10, take that deep breath to slow things down, not be adding to the threat by thinking, what's going to happen to me if this goes wrong? What's this person going to do to me? All those kinds of things that just activate it again. So that's really why the two pieces need to go together, the physiologic and the cognitive, the thinking. What am I telling myself? How am I responding to this once I'm able to get my physiology, that my fight or flight calmed down? So what do we do about it? Exactly what everyone is saying here. Stop, right? Taking a deep breath is a good way to do it. Count to 10. If you need to, remove yourself from the situation for a minute. Use any kind of strategy to interrupt that process, because otherwise it's just throwing kindling onto the fire. If I let myself escalate with fight or flight, then I'm going to be more of a threat to the other person. So they'll escalate. And pretty soon we're just going back and forth and back and forth. And I'm sure we've all seen that happen around us. On this slide, you'll see I have the two-pronged approach to changing the response. It's exactly what we were just talking about. What I'm thinking, how I'm approaching it from the thinking side, and how my body is reacting. So I got stuff out of order here. Any questions or comments, thoughts, observations about the physiology of fight or flight? What happens with the body, ways to turn that off? particularly interested if people care to share things that they use that are effective at calming that system when it gets turned on.
So, Dr. Reese, I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but there was a question about how you practice controlling fight or flight before you find yourself in a conflict.
Yeah, good question, right? So, like any skill, if I wait until I'm in the middle of a situation where I feel threatened and I'm trying to figure out how to do this, what are the odds that I'm going to do it well? Probably not very good, right? If you're an athlete, if you're a musician, anything like that, we always practice the skill that we want before the kind of high stakes time that we need it. And so what this comes down to is being able to practice relaxation on a regular basis so that when I'm stressed, when I'm in a conflict, when my amygdala is getting turned on, it's easy for me to say, oh, I know how to take a deep breath and get myself nice and relaxed. If you're waiting until the conflict and somebody's in your face screaming at you, and you're like, wait a second, that guy, that Navy guy said something about this. What was it? Vagus nerve? What? It's going to be a lot harder to do it, right? So building relaxation into just kind of your daily lifestyle, making sure that you take time for self-care, that you tune into what your body is doing, that you know what your breathing is doing, that you know how to take deep breaths, that you can sense where your muscles are at and know how to get in a relaxed state. It's really important to have that skill ahead of time. There are some other kind of preventative things we can do to reduce the likelihood of these things coming up, right? So I think so we're going to get to those two. I actually have those in a slide. So we'll follow up more on that question, Tori. Does that help a little bit? Or do you have more questions about that, more comments about that? Okay. Anyone want to add to that? What are things that people have done to get ready? I've stayed married for 33 years. Care to expand on like exactly what you do to manage stressors in a marriage? Because that's great. You definitely have to manage conflict there. All right, let's see what we have next. So this is partly getting back to what Tora is asking, right? How do I practice that? It does take a fair amount of self-observation, right? Like we don't always, unless you practice it, we don't always know to tune in when our heart rate starts increasing, when we start feeling muscle tension. Sometimes we don't notice it until we're really tense or we actually get a headache or we start to feel sore from it. We're like, oh, wow, I've really been tense, right? But with practice, and if you start teaching yourself how to be self-aware, then you'll notice like, oh, that made me upset. And I can tell that my amygdala is putting me in a defensive stance. Also knowing what our triggers are, right? Each of us tend to be a little bit vulnerable to different kinds of, like we have our triggers, our hot buttons, the things that can set us off. Knowing what those are and knowing if you're going into a situation where those are likely to be triggered can help you out. You can prepare yourself ahead of time so you don't get blindsided. Another thing that is helpful to learn how to do to kind of practice so you can do it when it comes up is, what are my feelings telling me to do now? Right? So we talked about how fight or flight is really telling us to fight or to flee. And if someone is getting in my face and my feelings are saying, get back, defend yourself, make sure you argue them down, but like actually physically fighting isn't the right response. Being able to pause and say, okay, well, I'm feeling defensive. Why am I feeling defensive? And now that I can observe that, what do I want to do about it? Do I want to escalate? There might be times when that's appropriate. Other times you might choose to like remove yourself or try and understand them, help them de-escalate. So being able to tune in and be self-aware is also a good skill to practice. And then that last question there is really kind of the core of it. When we have these intense emotions come up, they really are survival instincts, right? And they may push us to do things that might not be what we would do if we were, kind of had our wits about us, right? So exactly like this last comment here from Trisha, don't react till we've both had time to think. It's getting at this point exactly right. Sometimes our reactions, our emotions are pushing us to do something that's not really what we want to do. So being able to pause and know, like, these are my values. This is the type of person who I want to be. even though I'm feeling threatened, can I take a deep breath, do all the things we just talked about, quiet the system down enough so that I can actually do the things that are consistent with me being who I want to be, rather than just flying off the handle. Yeah, exactly. So Trisha added more, stopping and thinking why they're acting that way, realizing what they're trying to protect themselves and their reaction. That's excellent. So we're going to get at that more too, right? So once I can contain my own kind of fight or flight response, the trigger that my amygdala has to get me worked up, that's the whole thing that we're talking about, right? If I can keep from adding to this fire, then I can start to understand what's going on and really get to the work of conflict resolution, right? But first, I have to be able to de-escalate and prevent escalation, which is most likely going to start with yourself. If you can't manage your own reaction, you're not going to be in a very good position to help someone else get their feelings in check and understand what's bothering them. So thanks for that input. How do I know myself? There are lots of different tools, techniques, strategies. So this also gets back to the previous question, how do we prepare ourselves? Has anyone ever heard of this idea of emotional intelligence, and would anyone be willing to comment on it beyond what I have here?
This is Barbara. I think that it really is the ability to kind of get above a current situation. It's being smart about how you respond to things and how you respond to people. I know at Impact we have this kind of no judgment is part of our culture, and so it's difficult for some people to do that. And so I think emotional intelligence is really an interesting thing. I am always curious if I think some are kind of naturally born with it and others have to really work hard to kind of achieve it or find it.
Yeah, and I like how you said that, right? Getting above things and really being kind of getting above the emotional drives and impulses, right? Because this is focusing really on what emotions are doing within us and within other people, and how that shapes how we approach the world, on ourselves and each other. And so, like, for example, the no judgment zone. We're human. We're going to make judgments, right? That's how our brains work. We kind of make quick, snap judgments and assessments. But really, what emotional intelligence is getting at with that example is to say, look, okay, I'm feeling this. I'm feeling either judged or judgmental or whatever it is. But I have the emotional intelligence to be aware of that, to understand why I have that feeling, or maybe why I'm responding to this person in a certain way. And so now, because I can see those dynamics, that interplay, I can now make a choice of what I do with it. I can act in a non-judgmental way because I've understood what's driving me and pushing me. So I think that's kind of the crux of the emotional intelligence, is being aware of emotions, understanding how to learn from them and use them, and then to kind of regulate them when they come up, rather than just being, kind of falling victim to an emotional reaction.
Can I interject something with emotional intelligence? So that's a yes. In my master's course, we've been talking about this, and what I found fascinating, and I just thought I would bring up for comment from you. They were saying that studies show that your emotional intelligence, while it can grow in your lifetime, when they look at like corporations, the higher up on the power ladder you are, the lower your emotional intelligence is. Have you seen anything like that? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a little bit outside of my normal scope of practice, so I don't know that literature really well. I find that interesting. I wonder what if it wasn't emotional intelligence that got people higher up, I wonder if they had any ideas of what it was. I would think that being able to read people and manage reactions would be kind of important, but maybe it's less of a factor at that level.
Yeah, I think their point was the higher up you get, the more focused you are on revenues.
Oh, okay.
Like middle management or lower management would probably still have to have a lot of emotional intelligence.
Maybe that's the case, right? At that level, you're not doing as much of the personnel work, right? You're doing more program policy, kind of that type of work. So yeah, I'm not familiar with that research, so I couldn't comment on it in depth. Ashley, you were saying as part of emotional intelligence, reading the room. I would say it is, right? I think so. The emotional intelligence, I think, gets to all of it, right? Knowing my own emotions and also that of the others. And so reading the room would be, in this sense, is kind of getting the emotional tone, being able to make judgments from what people are saying, doing, how they're acting, on maybe their emotional state in particular. There's other components to reading the room and reading the people, but emotional intelligence is really focusing on the emotional side of it.
I just wanted to add one of the things, I was the fifth of six children, and I don't know if it's because I had lots of strong personalities around me that I just sat back and did a lot of watching.
Mhm.
And I think just reading what Ashley was saying, that I've learned to read a room really well. And I think it really adds, and to Paula's comment, I think people with higher emotional intelligence don't have that need to be the best at everything. They're just comfortable with wherever they're at in whatever situation.
Mhm. Yeah, I would suspect that middle children are probably pretty good at reading the room and emotional intelligence, right? Kind of having to navigate both sides of everything. Yeah. Mindfulness is kind of a trendy term, and I'm not sure that people always get the full gist of it. I think the part that people don't get with mindfulness, I think people often think of mindfulness as like meditation, right? Like kind of being present with what's there, and that's half of it. The other really important part of mindfulness is the non-judgmental part. And so what that is we can do anything mindfully, right? But so if we just take breathing, like breathing, a mindful breathing exercise is a very common place to start because breathing is a concrete physical action that can kind of help hold our focus. So the awareness of the present part is mindfulness says, I'm keeping my thoughts, my attention on what it is that I'm doing, whether it's breathing or walking or playing the piano or writing my report or interacting with my spouse. I'm fully present. My thoughts are here. And mindfulness says if my thoughts start to wander away, because brains like to wander, right? If my thoughts start to wander away, rather than getting upset about that and irritated, or rather than feeding into it, I just simply observe it like, oh, my brain wandered there. Let me gently focus back on what I'm doing. So mindfulness works on noticing those distractions, not fighting them, and then just shifting back to where we are. And now that's part of the non-judgmental part, right? As we're being present with what we're doing, it's not to be present to say, I'm doing this right or wrong or good or poorly, or I should or shouldn't be doing this, or why am I doing this, or why am I not doing that? There's none of the judgment there. Mindfulness is purely about observing and being present. This is a really useful tool to have when we are starting to get upset, or if I am feeling threatened. All these types of situations, if I've practiced mindfulness, it makes it a lot easier for me to observe, well, why am I having this reaction? What's going on here? What's happening to me? To just be present. Because as we've said before, right? Think before we react. When our emotions are intense, they want to push us to react. If I'm practicing mindfulness, then I know how to observe that feeling, let it be there. Mindfulness is not about getting rid of feelings, it's about just observing it. And then I can make a choice based on what I want to do if I'm able to observe without judgment. Any other thoughts or comments about mindfulness? All right. So mindfulness, because it is so popular, there's all kinds of apps and tools and videos on YouTube that make it really easy to practice. Like Headspace, Calm, those are popular apps. There's all kinds of things on YouTube. So I remember a long time ago when I was learning about all of this, came across a study that said that people who practiced relaxation exercises on a regular basis, and what the study looked at was at least 3 times a week for 15 minutes or more each time, actually builds up kind of an inoculation effect against stress. So if you're practicing relaxation or mindfulness regularly, your body is going to be less reactive to stress triggers and threats. It actually builds a bigger buffer for you to kind of give you more room to respond to those things before the stress reaction kicks in, before the amygdala sets off the alarm that says you need to protect yourself. So emotional intelligence and mindfulness are ways to be kind of self-aware of emotions and what's going on. Knowing your triggers, knowing what your vulnerabilities are, what kinds of things set you off, what kinds of things make you upset. Knowing that really helps going into a situation. So partly, if you know your triggers, you can work on resolving them, right? But also, I like to share a quick little story. When I was in grad school, we had these, like a part-time internship called a practicum. And I, of course, was doing neuropsychology practica. And I got accepted at 2 sites, both with really good supervisors. But one, the supervisor was very calm and laid back and relaxed. The other, the supervisor was really just uptight. And I noticed every time I talked to her on the phone, my heart was pounding. I was stressed. I couldn't talk clearly. She was just so intense. I chose to work with her because I knew she set me off, and I knew I needed to learn to be able to work with people that like that. And sure enough, I got to the office and started doing my practicum, and she was like that with everyone. She would walk into a room and just like a whirlwind, and everyone would get stressed out and worked up. So like her style of just being critical and judgmental and demanding was a trigger for me. And so fortunately, over the course of that practicum, I was able to kind of desensitize myself to that trigger and say, all right, this is how she presents herself. I can learn to tune that out and focus on what it is that I need to get out of what she's saying. So here are my tasks that I need to get and not respond to the things that have been triggers before. So knowing what your triggers are can help you decrease your response to it and also prepare yourself if you're going into a situation where you think they're likely to be present. Any comments or thoughts about triggers, things people have experienced? Keep asking for comments and nobody has experiences. All right, and then the last one is self-care, right? Kind of the big picture, and we talked about this a little bit. If you are generally living your life in a way that is taking care of yourself, that lets you kind of recharge and recover from all the stressors that face us in life, you're going to be in a better position. You're going to have more of a buffer to deal with those threats and those triggers when they do come up, as opposed to if you're always living on the edge. And I would suspect that many of us have seen this over the last year with the whole pandemic and all the added stress that's added to people. We've seen a lot of people get kind of pushed up to the limit where they've had so many demands that they're running out of the energy to give the buffer that we'd normally have. So being able to be aware of that, to step back and say, I need to build in time for myself. I need to figure out how I recharge, how I dissipate stress, whether it's talking about it with people, whether I dissipate through exercise, music, art, cooking. I've known people who dissipate their stress through cleaning. So, whatever works is the best. Yeah, so Tori, triggered by uncertainty. Yeah, I think that's probably one that people have experienced a lot over the last year or so, right? Um, if you're willing to share, how you figured that out, or what your response is to that, that would be great. I'm not pressuring you to, maybe a little bit personal. Still learning. All right. But at least you've identified, right? And so if you were to use like mindfulness or something like that, when the uncertainty comes up and you feel that amygdala try and kick in, if you're practicing mindfulness, you can pause and observe that, right? People said take a breath, count to 10. Just pause and observe. I wonder what this uncertainty is about. What is the fear here? What is my brain trying to tell me to do? Is it trying to tell me to get away from uncertainty, to throw a quick fix at it? What that is. Started a garden, helps to unwind and decompress. Yeah, that sounds great. I think nature is great. So any kind of hobby is good. I particularly like nature myself. I'm in Annapolis and there's lots of water here and I like sailing. So I'm pretty lucky that I get to get on the water. Yep, 20 more minutes in the session. I think that should work out just right. Okay. So, I don't know if any of you are wondering this, when we think about conflict resolution and de-escalation, I think there's probably a mindset of, okay, what do I need to do to resolve the problem for the other person and, get them to stop causing trouble for me, basically, right? Why spend so much time talking about us and our response and knowing ourselves? Anyone care to comment on that?
I did want to make a comment just on the last thing that you were saying, because I was all through COVID, I've been saying, going through COVID has been like having two jobs. And, I kept, as we were going through it and dealing with all these added things, including grant writing, I thought, well, I would say to my husband, it's not that I'm overwhelmed. I can't really define it yet. I haven't figured it out exactly. But I, in the end, decided that it was just being worn out. It's not, I knew I could do the work and I could get it all done. But in the end, I was tired. So your comment about, if you could take 15 minutes 3 times a week, and with that, the benefit that would have, my first thought was, oh my gosh, that sounds almost impossible.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to comment because I think many of us are in that same boat. Like the person with the garden, really, I find my calm in weeding and those things where your mind can just go away. But the other thing is, any day I get home before the sunset, I just sit out in the backyard for a few minutes and just absorb that sunset color and the quiet. And honestly, I think that's really important. And I'm definitely taking that away today, that it's really realizing that even just a few minutes here and there throughout a week will make a difference. So I just wanted to add that because you just kind of got me thinking on a different direction.
Well, thanks for making that point, Barbara. And you bring up something else, right? So while it would be great to be able to do that, not all of us can find 20 minutes in a day to just go sit and soak up the sunset or something like that, right? It's important to also be able to try and build that in as something that's just as important for our well-being as completing a task at work. But, so I work at the Naval Academy, and the midshipmen here are very high performing, very capable kids, and they're under a lot of pressure, right? Their schedules run often from 5 a.m. till midnight or 1 a.m., right? They are going all the time. And if I suggest, sit down and practice mindfulness for 15 or 20 minutes, they're going to laugh at me and walk away like, sounds good, sir, but it's not going to happen. So one of the suggestions that I have for them is to practice it occasionally, but build small chunks of relaxation into your day. Like they walk between classes. I tell them why you're walking between classes. Practice some deep breathing. Even for the 2 minutes or 3 minutes you sit down before the lecture starts, build it into your routine that those 3 minutes before the lecture starts, you take a moment to just reflect, to get centered, to breathe, to check your muscle tension, to release that. So I think there's plenty of benefit in building small bits of it in throughout the day. It's all about increasing the awareness of it and being part of it.
Thank you.
Yep. So why are we talking about me? So the comments here in the chat are exactly right. So I can't control the other person. I can control me. And if I make sure I'm not adding fuel to the fire, then it's not going to keep getting out of control, right? If I get me in check, then all I have to deal with is the problem that's here in front of me and not a bigger problem that I've added because of all of my things that are getting thrown on top of it. So Tricia says, as a mom and volunteer, I tend to do and be for everyone else. I've had to make myself step back and be okay with saying no. It's actually allowed me to do better at what I say yes to, including myself. Absolutely, we have to find that balance, right? We only have so much to give. And if we're not putting something back in the system, we eventually run out of anything to give, and it can actually compound things because then we are more easily triggered. That stress response comes up even more easily. Thanks for sharing that. My mom always used to like to say it takes 2 to tango, right? So if I take myself out of the equation, then that certainly makes a difference. So we've talked now about how to turn off the amygdala with the relaxation response. We've talked a little bit about how that opens up the opportunity to engage in value-directed behavior. So instead of defensive, kind of emotionally reactive driven behavior, people said count to 10, decide how you really want to react. So we've talked about the value-directed behavior. Now, implicit in that, and we didn't really talk about that much, is you need to know what your values are, right? You need to know what drives you and what matters to you. We're going to take a brief look at a number of different models of conflict resolution, and you'll see where some of the foundations of how conflict arises tie into values. So it's really important to know where you stand. What are your dead set must-have values and priorities, and what are the ones that you can fluctuate on? So this last one down here, time to die in a funeral eulogy, may seem a little bit odd, but if any of you have read Stephen Covey's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, you know what I'm talking about. So Stephen Covey talks about values and knowing your own personal values, and He even talks about writing a personal mission statement once you know what your values are. And in order to like determine what your values are, he had a clever little strategy to do that. And I liked it. He said, imagine yourself at your own funeral. What would you want people to say about you? Do you want them to say things like you had a garage full of Ferraris, or she had the most beautiful roses on the street? Or do you want them to say that, you know, she was patient, that she was a hard worker, that he was kind to everyone? Like, thinking of it from that perspective can help be a start to understanding what really matters to you most. And then once you start clarifying what those values are, then you translate them into behavior. So if patience matters to me, what does that mean at work? What does that mean with my family? What does that mean with my hobbies? What does that mean with myself? If success matters to me, well, what is that? Is that success in health, financial, being a leader? What does that mean? So define your values, figure out how that translates into behavior, and then you can use those values to guide you at times of conflict. Because remember, conflict is getting an emotional reaction. The emotion says, do this in a way that might not be consistent with your values. So if you practice and apply everything we've talked about, you can slow it down and say, well, my values say I want to be this kind of person. So how does this kind of person act in this kind of conflictual setting? Okay, now we're finally ready to work with the other person who's angry and worked up. What do we do about that? Again, Stephen Covey, seek first to understand, then to be understood. So we're going to briefly talk about communication strategies, right? Clearly not time to get to it in depth. Asking open-ended questions. So it really gets down to really trying to understand what it is, and a couple of people have said this in chat, what it is that is really at the root of what's making the other person upset. So the conflict resolution models that we'll review really quickly, we'll get to that, but also just patient listening with the intent to understand can help a lot. What is the friction point? What is the root cause of conflict or tension between what the other person wants and what I want or what I can do? And what do they absolutely need to feel their needs are met? What's the bare minimum? So really trying to understand from their perspective first. A lot of us will listen to respond rather than listening to understand. So if you find yourself with your answer ready to go and you're just sitting there waiting for them to finish their sentence and wait for that period so you can say what you have in your head, you're probably listening to respond rather than listening to understand. There are a lot of different ways to think about listening. These are a few of them. Active listening says, I'm fully concentrating, I'm understanding, and I'm remembering this. So I'm totally engaged. My whole intent, my whole purpose here is to understand you, and I'm engaged in the process. Reflective listening takes a little bit of a twist on it. It says, now that I've listened and understood, I'm going to reflect it back, or I'm going to say it back to you to A, show you that I'm listening to you, and B, to make sure that I'm understanding it the way that you're trying to communicate it, to make sure that we're on the same page here. Empathic listening has to do with making the emotional connection, right? So you can see how the others may be kind of factual and emotionally detached. Sometimes making an emotional connection, really understanding what they're feeling and validating the feeling can be more important to the person than just getting the facts of what they're saying. Pause in case anyone wants to jump in, and then we'll go on to the rest.
I would just say that this I find is really important in the business that we do, because we at our food bank in Tucson have the most amazing clients. There's almost never conflict. But in probably the last 11 years, I've only had conflict with 2 people. And I think that what happens in our community, these people who are coming because they're hungry and they're coming to the food bank, they come already stressed and already concerned. And so they're already elevated to a certain degree. They may not look elevated on the outside, but inside they're kind of elevated. And I think that this is part of our training and our volunteers program, that we have to be ready to understand to be able to listen to people. And sometimes just listening is enough to kind of bring them down, or to assure them that we are going to give them food today, and then let them share and kind of get anything off their chest. So I think that's really been one of our keys to success. And I think especially as a food bank industry, we have a lot of opportunity to avoid conflict just by that first step there.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up another good point, Barbara, that when people are already at the edge and they are kind of primed, almost ready to go off, it might not take much. And if someone gets angry at me, I'm gonna immediately take it personally, right? But if I can pause and say, you know what, this probably isn't about me as much as this person has a lot going on, and here's one more thing where they're having to fight, to argue, to battle. If I can make it not personal about me, then I'm in a much better position to understand and help address this concern here. So, okay, I know myself, I'm really listening, now what? Just want to briefly go through, I think I have 8 or 9 different types of models here. And again, like I said at the beginning, my intention is not to make you experts at conflict resolution, but to use these partly to talk about the values and understanding, that there's often something else going on, or being able to get out what the core kind of driving force is, and then just have different ways of looking at it, right? Sometimes it helps us to be able to structure what we're doing. And so these are ways of doing that. So this stairway model says that conflicts are based in either interest, power, or rights. And if you think about that, right, if I'm interested in something, but I don't feel my power is being taken away, I'm going to be less worked up than if I feel like you're taking away my power or actually infringing on my rights. So you can see how there'd be an escalation there, and people will get more upset about things that are higher on that stairway. Satisfaction triangle deepens that in the sense that it looks at kind of the cost involved in that, right? So, or what I'm getting out of that. So am I just looking for a result, right? Do I want X amount of dollars or X amount of resources or whatever? Or am I more concerned about the process? Am I looking at fairness? Like, well, if I'm doing this, then you have to do that. Or if I'm disengaged, then you're that engaged. Is the process the important part of it? Or is it really emotionally driven? I've been hurt, I've been offended, and I want justice. I want that made right. So being able to understand what from that angle, what is driving it could be useful. The circle of conflict as a model is actually pretty complex. I didn't have room to put all the detail on here, but really, it's getting at it from the same idea from a different angle, really understanding what drives the conflict. Is this a threat to values? Is this just a data-driven thing, right? Is this external? Is this emotional? Is this about my interests? Is this about this structure and how things are built? So looking at it from that perspective. Oftentimes it can come down to nothing more than trust, right? My trust is violated and now I don't have trust. And so I'm going to be defensive and on guard until that trust is rebuilt. So being able to identify if it is a question of trust, and then rather than being engaged in kind of the logistics of what we're talking about, being able to step back to that relationship and work on rebuilding the trust first, and then get back to the logistics of whatever it is that we're working out. Sometimes people have an expectation of reciprocity and fairness, and they think, if I'm doing all this, like I said before with one of the other ones, then I expect you to do the same thing too, kind of on a transactional level. Anyone that pays any attention to like human psychology, cognitive psychology, you know that humans have all kinds of weird biases in how we process and respond to things. Economists like to talk about humans as rational creatures, but we are not rational at all. We do all kinds of irrational things. And one of the irrational biases that we have is that research has shown us that if I feel like I'm losing something or giving something up, the cost of that to me is twice as much as the pleasure of what I'm getting. So keeping that in mind, right? If someone feels like they're giving up something in part of a negotiation or a deal or in working out a situation, that's going to be much more difficult than it would be gratifying for a person to think, okay, well, I've got this gain. Like, well, they may think, well, of course I get that. I deserve that. I expected to get that. But if you're trying to take away from me something that I think is mine or that I want to have, that's going to have much more of an impact on me than the benefit of getting something. So when it comes to negotiating, that can be an important thing to keep in mind. Boundaries and norms can also be a factor. So again, this also gets back to the seek first to understand. Understanding what someone's expectations are for boundaries of what they will and won't do, what they think they're expected to do, or should do for their position or whatever. And then social styles, model personality styles. I think someone said this earlier, understanding how different people work and what the dynamics are, reading the room and all of that, right? There's all different kinds of ways that we look at personality styles, the Myers-Briggs, lots of different things like that, lots of ways to understand that. And then finally, we want to be able to move beyond the conflict, right? So this is also another model. People identify with the conflict, and so actually the conflict itself becomes self-sustaining. And there can actually be resistance to and reluctance to let go of the conflict because the sense of identity is gone too. And so letting go, you go through all these stages that we do with any type of loss, denial, anger, acceptance, all of that. So being patient as someone is going through that and let them go through the process can be important. So I know we're down to just a couple more minutes here. If we've done everything and they still don't budge, then we have to get down to the bare bones. We can agree to disagree. What can I offer if we can't get to any compromise? Is there any way that we can get a minimal satisfaction? What is the minimum that I have to do by my contract, by my position or service or whatever? And just doing that, even if the tension is there. Sometimes it's just acknowledging that here is conflict and I have to do this. And I've tried to resolve the conflict and I can't, but I still have to do this. And so just looking at it from that perspective. So I wasn't watching the chat. Isn't there a power disparity that affects this type of interaction? So Penny, I don't know which one. I wasn't paying attention. I didn't see which type of interaction that is. But power disparities are always a factor, right? We always need to be aware of power differentials. And if you have people coming into you as a food bank and they're asking for services, there is a built-in power differential. They're in a more vulnerable spot, which could let them be either more defensive, more on the fight side, or more subservient and less willing to advocate for what they want, more on the flight side. Yeah, so I think being aware of those power differentials, not only what I'm aware of, but trying to get in their shoes and how they might see it too, because we don't always understand those dynamics in a way that the other person does. So I've thrown a lot at you in an hour. We've covered a lot of ground. I appreciate the input and comments and everything. I have a couple minutes for any questions or comments that people have. None at all. We're all expert negotiators now. All right. Well, thank you again for inviting me and for having me. And like I said, thanks for making this a discussion instead of just a lecture. I really don't like doing it that way. So I appreciate all the input.
Oh, I just want to say thank you so much. I know I can only imagine what your schedule looks like. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. I know I feel calmer already. So oops, that was my timer. So thank you so much. And yeah, we'll just send folks back to the main session. But if there are any questions that come up afterwards, you can feel free to send them to me, Ashley at azfoodbanks.org, and maybe I can send them over to Dr. Reese.
Absolutely. Be happy to.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Good, thanks.